Okay, so this is the lecture on the first days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this should be lecture number 5 on the series of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk specifically about the first few days of the crisis in October of 1962. So you already have some background in President Kennedy and of the events of the Bay of Pigs. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, the Bay of Pigs was a really substantially important event to the Kennedy administration, and important for a lot of reasons, one of which was because it really influenced the relationship that Kennedy had with his advisors. And specifically, it influenced the relationship that Kennedy had with his Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that relationship was very deeply rocked after the catastrophe of the Bay of Pigs and the mess that event ended up being. So, what happened here? How did these events begin? Well, before I share that with you, I want to show you this slide. And it's an image of a plaque that sat on President Kennedy's desk in the months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was made for him by his wife, and you'll see both of their initials in the top of that plaque. So Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, JBK, and then John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, the two sets of initials. And Jacqueline gave him this plaque to commemorate this incredibly tense 13-day period, which we have come to call the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the first date on this plaque is October 16th. And in fact, October 16th is a critical day, but it's not the only day that matters. In the days just prior to the 16th, there were some events that were happening as well. And we really need to actually start by talking not about the 16th, but what was going on October 14th and 15th. And this next slide gives you some indication of what was happening. On the 14th and 15th of October of 1962, the United States military had routine spy planes that were taking photographs from high above the cloud line in Cuba. This was not unusual. This was going on over the Soviet Union and over other areas that we were concerned about. Berlin was another place where spy planes were routinely sent out to take photographs. And the goal was exactly what you can see. It was to take aerial photographs of places of interest. Cuba was a significant interest to us for reasons that have been established in previous lectures. And when that U-2 spy plane came down, the film was analyzed. So on the 15th of October, the State Department and its analysts looked at the film that had been taken by that spy plane and discovered some, what I think it's fair to say are some extremely suspicious activities going on in Cuba. The image that you're looking at right now is from sort of a layman's eye, somebody like me or you who doesn't really know a lot about analyzing U-2 spy planes aerial photographs. Images like this may not mean anything, but what it meant to the State Department and what was instantly obvious was that there was a massive installation of some kind going in Cuba. And as the analysts worked harder and harder to identify the objects, what they came to soon find out was that these were not merely, innocuous installations. These weren't sort of innocent installations going in Cuba. Rather, these were weapons installations. Now, from the view that we have, it's a little bit difficult to see what you're looking at. But if you look at the photograph, you can start to make out some semi-truck trailers. There's actually a group of trucks in the bottom right-hand side of the photograph. You can see a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think it is, trucks lined up next to each other. And then you can see some larger semi-trucks more towards the center and then just to the right, or I'm sorry, to the left, where that large clearing is. These are weapons silos. And in the next photograph I'm going to show you, you can see things clearly labeled. Now, this photograph was taken in November, very early November, actually at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's a much clearer photograph. These photographs were not available until the United States did some more low-level flyovers, taking even more close-up pictures. But you can see we have, and on the photograph, it's labeled MRBM Launch Site 2. That's Medium Range Ballistic Missile Launch Site. The first photograph that you were looking at, and I'll click back to it, that first photograph that you were looking at, the analysts were able to identify from this photograph that these, in fact, were nuclear installations that were being put in Cuba. So on the 15th of October, after it was confirmed by multiple experts at the State Department, they immediately took their findings to the White House. And so, therefore, on October 16th, the president is informed that the Soviet Union, as well as Cuba, have begun arming themselves with nuclear weapons. The slide that I'm showing you right now are some images. The first one at the top is obviously a map of Cuba, and you can see some of the important sites of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can see the San Cristobal, MRBM, and the Sigua La Grande, MRBM site, and one of them just outside of Havana and one to the south and east of Havana. But then there's also the Guanje IRBM site. As the Cuban Missile Crisis goes on, the U.S. government was able to identify not just medium-range ballistic missiles, but also intermediate. These missiles were able to actually go even further than those medium-range ballistic missiles. And so the threat becomes even more intensified as our knowledge of what we were seeing became more and more clear. The bottom image here, the land-based missiles of the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, these are some of the missiles, and you can do, if you're interested in these kinds of things, if that's something that is one of your areas of interest, I would encourage you to do some research on some of these missiles. I certainly am not an expert on any of these missile programs, but I can tell you that the missiles that we have now in our arsenal, in the U.S. arsenal, are, hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, more powerful than these missiles. Nevertheless, these missiles were still extremely powerful, and so powerful, in fact, that in the next slide, what you'll see is the range of these missiles. So Havana, Cuba being at the center, the medium-range ballistic missiles had the range of the inner dark circle. On October 16th, the U.S. government identified these medium-range ballistic missile sites and immediately identified President Kennedy of those missile sites. Several days in, after more investigation, the U.S. government identified intermediate ballistic missile sites whose range went even further, and that's the outer ring that you see there. So it gives you a sense of the scale of this, the danger of this, and the intensity of this finding as far as the Kennedy administration was concerned. So the Kennedy administration, being the administration that this crisis, whose lap this crisis sort of falls into, we've already done some discussion about that. But I want to talk to you a little bit about not just John Kennedy, but also his brother Robert, or Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, during the political campaign, was John Kennedy's closest advisor, and in fact, he ran John Kennedy's political campaign. And when any president goes into the White House, he has the opportunity to appoint different positions. And one position that the president appoints is the Attorney General. And essentially, the Attorney General is like the top lawyer in the country. And Bobby Kennedy, being a lawyer, being John Kennedy's right hand throughout the campaign, and obviously his brother, he appointed him to the Attorney General position. Now, attorney generals generally are not super closely associated either with presidential politics or with major international events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. But as you probably can imagine, because Bobby Kennedy was the brother of the president, he had a particularly close relationship with the president and was therefore very closely involved in all levels of John Kennedy's administration. So much so that, in fact, Lyndon Johnson, who was the vice president under Kennedy, was almost entirely pushed out of the conversation. Now, Lyndon Johnson is not going to play a huge role in this conversation about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he is going to be a huge player after 1963. Because remember, the following November, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, John Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and Lyndon Johnson takes the oath of office while flying back to Washington, D.C., and becomes the President of the United States. So while Bobby Kennedy was the closest advisor to John Kennedy, he was not the man that was going to take over the White House. In fact, that was Lyndon Johnson. So the relationship that Kennedy, both Kennedys, frankly, the relationship that they had with Lyndon Johnson becomes much more important later. So to sort of set you up with a little bit of that understanding, I'll just say, you know, Lyndon Johnson was a really, really powerful senator. He was probably one of the most politically powerful senators that the U.S. Senate has ever seen. He was the Senate Majority Leader. He was highly influential, and he himself aspired to become the president. But much to Lyndon Johnson's anger, it was John Kennedy and his brother Bobby, sort of working behind scenes to make it happen, who gets the nomination of the Democratic Party and goes on to win the White House in 1960. And Lyndon Johnson was enraged. I mean, it made him really angry. He particularly didn't like Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy didn't like him either. You know, there was no love lost between the two of them. But the Kennedys also knew that because of the power that Lyndon Johnson had in Congress, they needed him, they could use him in the White House. And so they gave him, sort of offered him, you know, the carrot, the little leftovers of, you know, run as the vice president on the ticket. And so Lyndon Johnson accepted the vice presidency, but really never was fully on board with Kennedys. They really did not spend much time together. And certainly, Lyndon Johnson was not part of the major decisions, not entirely unlike Truman and Roosevelt, if you remember those conversations. There's one other character I want to talk about in the Kennedy White House, and that is a man named Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense, and he is another enduring character. He's going to outlive the Kennedys. He's going to be the Secretary of Defense for Lyndon Johnson's administration, and he's going to run the Vietnam War with Lyndon Johnson. And so he becomes, again, a much more important character later. But it was Robert McNamara who later in his life wrote a book called The 11 Lessons on the Life of Robert McNamara, in which he talks about not only the experience of being Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also he makes it really clear the stakes. The stakes could not have been higher here. We're talking about full nuclear war, world war. If the United States, after finding out about the Russians and their bombs on Cuba, if the wrong decision is made, if a move to remove those weapons leads to the U.S. invading or in any way striking Cuba, that could lead to the Russians striking back at us. And striking at us could easily include striking Berlin. And if Berlin was struck, that's NATO. And the NATO alliance would then have been obligated to intervene. And if the NATO alliance intervenes, it's world war. But it's not World War II, it's World War III, which is a nuclear war. And so again, the stakes could not have been higher. And Robert McNamara, in his book, The 11 Lessons on the Life of Robert McNamara, said, there'll be no second chances with nuclear war. The final picture I want to show you in this brief series here is probably one of the most iconic photographs taken during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy walking on the back balcony outside of the Oval Office in close consultation. And it's going to be the decisions that these two men make that are going to make the difference truly between World War III and the world waking up to a non-nuclear world. So, or a world free of nuclear war anyway. So, but we're going to talk about their decisions and the decisions that they made in the next lecture. So, okay, thanks.